Here's a strange fact most readers never stop to notice. God renames Jacob to Israel in Genesis 32, and by Genesis 45, the biblical narrator has used the name Jacob more than 70 times since. 70. After the renaming. If a new name from God is meant to signal a completed transformation, that's an odd way to write the rest of the story. It gets stranger. Simon is renamed Peter in the first chapter of John's Gospel, and 3 chapters from the end, Jesus is still calling him Simon, son of John. Not Peter, Simon, right before restoring him after his most humiliating failure. Why would God, or Christ, keep going back to the name that was supposedly replaced? Either the renaming didn't fully take, or renaming was never about replacement in the first place. There's a reason Scripture keeps both names alive side by side, all the way to the final page of these stories, and it has less to do with erasing the past than most of us assume. To understand why, you have to go back before the wrestling match, back to the world that made a name mean something in the first place. We're somewhere in the Bronze Age, roughly 2,000 years before Christ, in the hill country and river valleys stretching between Mesopotamia and Canaan. This is not a world of nations with fixed borders and passports. It's a world of clans, extended families moving with flocks, tents, and covenants, tracing their identity through fathers, grandfathers, and the god or gods their household served. Documents recovered from sites like Mari and Nuzi, dating to roughly this general era, are commonly cited by scholars as background for exactly this kind of world. West Semitic clans naming children after circumstances of birth, family hopes, or the deity a household looked to for protection. The details of those tablets are debated in their specifics, but the broader picture they support is not. In that world, a name was rarely just a sound. It was often a small sentence about the child, a hope the parents had, a circumstance of the birth, sometimes a claim on the future. Names carried weight because a name was one of the only permanent records a family had. No birth certificates, no archives, just a name, spoken over and over, doing the work of memory. Jacob's name already carried weight like that before God ever touched it. He was born grasping his brother's heel, and the name itself, in the language of the text, plays on that image. Grasping, reaching, coming out of the womb, already taking hold of something. It's not a flattering origin, and Jacob spent the next several decades living up to it. A birthright talked out of a hungry brother, a blessing taken through disguise and deception. Then 20 years in exile, working for a father-in-law who outmaneuvered him as thoroughly as he'd outmaneuvered his own brother. Jacob built a life in those years. Wives, children, flocks, real wealth. But he built it the same way he started, grasping. Now he's heading home. Genesis 32 finds him on the edge of the land God promised his grandfather Abraham at a river crossing called the Jabbok in the hill country east of the Jordan. Waiting on the other side of that homecoming is the one person Jacob has spent 20 years dreading, his brother Esau, the one he cheated out of a blessing and fled from in fear of his life. Jacob sends gifts ahead. He splits his camp into groups, hedging against disaster. He does what a grasping man does when he's afraid. He manages the situation, he plans, he negotiates, and then, alone, in the dark, on the riverbank, something happens that no amount of planning could have prepared him for. A figure appears. Genesis doesn't rush to tell us who it is. It simply says a man wrestled with him through the night until the breaking of day. No introduction, no explanation, just conflict, physical and prolonged, between Jacob and someone the text is deliberately cautious about naming. This is the scene the renaming happens inside of. Not a throne room, not a temple, not a moment of triumph, a wrestling match in the dark that Jacob does not win outright and does not fully understand. And it's in the middle of that struggle, with dawn breaking and Jacob refusing to let go, that the words come that will define the rest of the story. What is your name? It's a strange question for the figure to ask. He's the one with power in this scene. He's the one who has just dislocated Jacob's hip with what the text calls a mere touch. He clearly knows exactly who he's wrestling. So why ask a question he already knows the answer to? What is your name? and Jacob answers, Jacob. Genesis 32:27. Here's the detail worth slowing down for. Jacob has to say his own name out loud, in the dark, exhausted, physically broken, before anything changes. Not before he's forgiven, not before he's proven himself, before he simply admits who he's been. Think about what that name meant by this point in the story. Jacob wasn't just a name to him anymore, it was a confession. Grasper, heel grabber, the one who takes what isn't his. 20 years of that reputation, and now, alone in the dark with a stranger who won't let go, he has to say it out loud, to someone who already knows. This isn't a magic word unlocking a transformation. It's an honest admission happening first, the truth about who Jacob has been, spoken before anything new is offered. That changes what happens next, because the very next thing out of the stranger's mouth isn't correction. It's a new name. You'd expect, after that kind of confession, some kind of rebuke. A reckoning for the deception, the manipulation, the decades of grasping. Instead, Genesis 32:28 gives us this. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed. Prevailed. That word deserves a second look. Jacob has just been struck hard enough to leave him limping for the rest of the scene, hardly a picture of prevailing in any conventional sense. Scholars are divided on the exact nuance of the underlying Hebrew here. Some read it as, you have striven and endured. Others read it closer to, you have contended and held your ground. What isn't divided is the plain narrative fact sitting in front of us. A man who did not win the fight in any obvious way is told that he prevailed. That's the detail. Not, he won, therefore he gets a new name. It's, he held on, wounded, limping, without letting go, and that itself is called prevailing. It's a little like a marathon runner who collapses at the finish line. Nobody watching would call that graceful. But finishing at all, in that condition, is still the victory being measured, not the manner of the running, but the refusal to release his grip on the line. The analogy doesn't prove anything about the text, it just helps the picture land, which means the name Israel isn't a reward for a clean victory. It's a name given in the middle of a wound, and that's worth remembering, because it's about to matter more than it seems. Here's where the story could have ended cleanly. New name given, scene closed, moving on. Genesis 32:29 shows Jacob trying to close it that way himself. He presses the figure, tell me your name, please, and the answer he gets back is almost a non-answer. Why is it that you ask my name? The figure blesses him there and refuses to be named in return. That's an overlooked asymmetry worth sitting with. Jacob's name gets spoken, examined, and changed. The other party's name stays hidden entirely. One identity is opened up completely, the other stays behind a veil. Whatever, or whoever, Jacob wrestled that night remains, by the text's own choice, unresolved. Later tradition, and much of the church, has read this figure as a theophany or a Christophany, and Hosea 12 verses 3-4 later connects this same encounter to an angel. The text itself, though, leaves the identification genuinely open, and that ambiguity isn't a gap for us to fill in confidently. It's part of what the passage is doing. But there's a detail that actually carries this thesis forward, and it's easy to miss because it happens in the very next verse, and doesn't announce itself as significant at all. Genesis 32:30 says Jacob named the place Peniel, face of God, because he had seen God face to face and survived. Then verse 31, the sun rose upon him as he passed over Penuel, limping because of his hip. Look at what the narrator does in that single sentence. Two things happen at once. The sun is rising, new day, new name, new identity dawning, and Jacob is limping, not one after the other, at the same time. The wound and the new name walk across that river together, in the same sentence, in the same body. That's not incidental. That's the pattern the rest of this story keeps finding. Again and again, God doesn't wait for the wound to heal before he gives the new name, and the old self doesn't vanish the moment the new name is spoken. It keeps limping right alongside it, visibly, for everyone in the story to see, which raises the exact question the text itself seems determined to answer, over the coming chapters. If Jacob is really Israel now, why does everyone, including the narrator, keep calling him Jacob? The answer starts to show itself almost immediately, and it's worth watching closely because it happens fast. Genesis 33 opens with Jacob lifting his eyes and seeing Esau approaching. The reunion he's dreaded for 20 years is finally here. And the text, one chapter after the renaming, in the very scene the renaming seems to have been preparing him for, the narrator reaches for the old name. It keeps happening, and it's worth counting a few of these rather than taking it on faith. Genesis 35. Jacob builds an altar at Bethel, and God appears to him again, renaming him Israel a second time, as if underlining something. And within the very same chapter, verse 27, the text says, Jacob came to his father Isaac. Genesis 37 opens the Joseph narrative with Jacob dwelt in the land. Genesis 42, when famine strikes and his sons go to Egypt for grain, it's Jacob who sends them. Genesis 45, when word comes back that Joseph is alive, it's Jacob's spirit revived, not Israel's. Genesis 46 opens the migration to Egypt with Israel took his journey, and by the end of that same short chapter, verse 28, he's Jacob again, sending Judah ahead to meet Joseph. This is not the narrator forgetting. Hebrew narrative doesn't work that loosely, and this book is far too deliberate with names elsewhere to be careless here. This looks like a choice, repeated across chapters and decades of story time, to keep both names available, depending on what the moment calls for. When the scene touches the family history, the deception, the fear, the human weakness, the text often reaches for Jacob. When the scene touches covenant, promise, or the nation being formed, it more often reaches for Israel. Both names stay true. Neither one gets retired. That pattern alone would be enough to reshape how most people think about renaming in Scripture. But before following it into the New Testament, it's worth going back one generation earlier, to the man whose covenant renaming came first, and who set the template Jacob's own story would follow. Abraham's story matters here for a reason that's easy to miss if you only remember the outline of it. Genesis 17 opens with God appearing to a 99-year-old man named Abram and establishing a covenant, the sign of which will be circumcision, introduced a few verses later in the same chapter. Bracketed right in the middle of that covenant scene, between the covenant being announced and the sign of it being explained, comes the renaming. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Genesis 17:5. Notice where that renaming sits in the structure of the chapter. It isn't a standalone moment. It's wedged directly inside a covenant ceremony, between promise and sign, as if the new name is itself part of the covenant's architecture. Not a separate blessing handed out afterward, but one of the covenant's own terms. And notice, too, what the new name claims, Father of a multitude of nations, spoken to a man who, at the point of hearing it, has exactly one son not yet born and one already fathered through Sarah's servant Hagar, a situation the text has already shown created real family pain and will again. The lexical picture here is debated in its precise philology. Scholars differ on the technical derivation behind the name Abraham. What the text does make clear, and what matters most for this thesis, is its own explicit wordplay. The name is deliberately tied by the narrator himself to the promise of multitudes, spoken over a man who currently has almost none of what the name describes. A few verses later, in Genesis 17:15, the same pattern repeats with Sarai, renamed Sarah, and the text records this as a separate, deliberate, divine speech, not folded quietly into Abram's renaming as an afterthought. Two names changed, two distinct pronouncements, both tied to a promise neither one of them will see fulfilled for another full year. Now here's where the pattern from Jacob's story shows up again, right on schedule. Genesis 22, 3 chapters after the renaming. Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." Genesis 21 verse 2. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son. Both new names, consistently, from this point forward. which actually makes an interesting contrast worth being honest about. Unlike Jacob, the text does mostly retire Abram and Sarai after Genesis 17, using the new names going forward with far more consistency than Jacob's story shows. That's a real difference, and it's worth naming rather than smoothing over, because it sharpens rather than weakens the thesis. Abraham and Sarah's covenant is sealed with circumcision, a permanent, physical, one-time sign, marking the covenant into the body itself. Jacob's covenant moment is a wound that simply heals into a limp, present in the story, but not marked by an ongoing ritual sign the way Abraham's is. Where the covenant carries its own lasting physical marker, the text leans more fully into the new name. Where it doesn't, the old name keeps surfacing to carry the history forward instead. Different mechanisms, same underlying commitment. Nothing about who these people actually were gets discarded in the process of becoming who they were promised to be. It's worth pausing on how differently a name change could go, because Scripture doesn't only show us renaming as gift. Sometimes it shows us renaming as conquest, and holding those pictures side by side sharpens everything that follows. Genesis 41 gives the first clear example, decades before Daniel's exile. Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, rises to become second in command over Egypt under Pharaoh, and Genesis 41:45 records, almost in passing, that Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, an Egyptian name given by an Egyptian ruler, marking Joseph's full absorption into the machinery of Egyptian court life. It's a small detail, easy to read past on the way to the more dramatic reunion scenes that follow, but it's the first instance in Scripture of a specific pattern, renaming as an act of a foreign power claiming and repackaging someone it now controls. The far more developed version of that same pattern comes centuries later, during the Babylonian exile. Somewhere around 605 BC, in the early deportations under Nebuchadnezzar II, a young man named Daniel was taken from Jerusalem to Babylon, along with 3 companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel 1:7 records what happened next in the Babylonian court. The chief official gave names to all 4 of them. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah became Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel himself was given the name Belteshazzar. This is the same basic act, a name change, spoken by an authority, but it comes from an entirely different direction than anything in Genesis. In the ancient world, renaming a captive or a servant by the conquering power was a recognized way of asserting ownership over that person's identity and, often, of tying them symbolically to the conquering nation's gods. Scholars generally understand these particular Babylonian names as invoking Babylonian deities, though the precise meanings and derivations are debated in the details. What isn't debated is the direction of the gesture. This is empire absorbing an identity, not covenant layering one on top of what already existed. And here's where the earlier pattern proves itself yet again, in a completely different setting, under a completely different kind of power. Read on through the rest of the book, and the narrator keeps calling him Daniel. Chapter 2, Chapter 5, Chapter 6, Chapter 9. Daniel, 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 in the narrator's own voice, telling the story from the inside. The imposed name, Belteshazzar, appears mostly in the mouths of Babylonian officials and Nebuchadnezzar himself, describing him from the empire's point of view, looking in. The narrator's own voice, telling the story to God's people, keeps returning to the name his own people gave him at birth. Put next to Jacob and Abraham, this becomes a genuinely illuminating contrast rather than a repetition of the same point already made. In Genesis, the old name survives alongside a name given in covenant by God as a layer of promise on top of a real history. In Daniel, the old name survives despite a name imposed in captivity by an empire as an attempt to overwrite an identity entirely. Same literary habit, keep both names alive, used to prove 2 very different things. One shows a name that adds, the other shows a name that tries and quietly fails to erase. That contrast matters because it means the keep both names pattern isn't just a quirk of Hebrew storytelling. It's doing real theological work. Whether the renaming comes from a father wrestling in the dark or an empire assigning new names in a foreign court, Scripture seems remarkably resistant to letting anyone's original identity simply disappear from the page, even when a whole empire wanted it to. There's a smaller, quieter version of this same instinct worth noticing before moving forward, because it shows the pattern isn't limited to men or to God speaking directly. In the book of Ruth, a woman named Naomi, having lost her husband and both her sons in a famine-driven move to Moab, returns to Bethlehem and tells the women there not to call her Naomi anymore. "Call me Mara," she says, "for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Naomi means something like pleasant. Mara means bitter. This is self-renaming, grief speaking its own name over itself. But the book doesn't end there, and it doesn't let that renaming stand unanswered. By the final chapter, after Ruth's loyalty, Boaz's kindness, and the birth of a grandson who will become part of the line leading to King David, the women of Bethlehem are the ones who speak, and they never once call her Mara. The narrator keeps calling her Naomi, straight through to the end. The bitter name she gave herself in grief gets quietly outlived, not by force, but by a community that kept using her original name until the story caught back up to it. A related version of this shows up in the prophet Hoshea, on a national scale rather than a personal one. Hoshea is told to name his children as living prophecy over Israel, a daughter called Lo Ruhamah, not pitied, and a son called Lo Ami, not my people, names meant to embody the nation's covenant rupture in the most intimate way possible, spoken over Hosea's own children. And then, later in the same book, the reversal comes just as deliberately. Hosea 2:23 promises that God will say to Lo Ami, "You are my people," and to the one called not pitied, "You are pitied." The names are not swapped out for entirely different ones. The exact same names are spoken again, with the negation removed, my people, answering directly to not my people. The old name isn't discarded. It's the very thing that gets addressed, corrected, and restored. It's a small thing, in a minor prophet easy to skip past. But it's the same instinct at a national scale. A name spoken honestly out of judgment, held alongside the name that would one day be true, until both could be seen at once, one answering the other, rather than replacing it. Which brings the story back to a lake in Galilee, roughly 13 centuries after Jacob limped across the Jabbok, where the exact same pattern is about to appear again, except this time it isn't a narrator quietly choosing which name to use. It's Jesus himself. If you're starting to notice that Scripture is unusually careful about keeping the wound and the new name in the same frame, that's not something most readings of this passage stop to point out. That noticing is the whole point of a video like this one, and if it's changing the way you'll read Genesis 32 from now on, that's worth sticking around for, because this pattern is about to show up in places you wouldn't expect. If you want to keep tracing it, subscribing means you won't miss where it goes next. Because Jacob limping into the sunrise, still called Jacob, isn't the last time this happens. It isn't even the strangest time it happens. There's a moment coming, centuries later, involving a fisherman on a different body of water entirely, where the exact same pattern shows up. Except this time, the man carrying two names side by side has just failed in the most public, humiliating way possible. And the one who insists on still using his old name isn't a narrator quietly choosing his words. It's Jesus himself. To see the connection properly, follow the detail already noticed at the Jabbok, and let it move forward through the rest of the Gospel of John. In John 1:42, Jesus renames Simon before Simon has done a single thing to earn it. "You are Simon, son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which, the text tells us plainly, translates to Peter, meaning rock. No test passed, no proof of stability offered, just a name, given as a kind of destination before the journey has even started. It's worth noting that this scene sits in the same opening chapter of John, where Andrew and Philip invite others to come and see, and where Nathanael is told that Jesus saw him before they'd ever met, a chapter already interested in the idea of being known before being proven. That alone echoes Jacob and Abraham both, a name given ahead of the character it describes, not after. But the deeper connection isn't in chapter 1, it's at the end of the book, and it's easy to walk right past it because it's disguised as a small detail of speech. Peter has just denied knowing Jesus 3 times, in public, hours after swearing he never would. The rooster crowed. He wept. Now, after the resurrection, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus is rebuilding this relationship over a charcoal fire, and 3 times he asks Peter the same question. And 3 times, John records Jesus addressing him the exact same way. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Not Peter. Simon, son of John, the precise phrase from John 1:42, word for word, repeated 3 separate times in John 21 verse 15 through 17. Pause on that, because the timing here is almost unbearable. This is the moment in the entire gospel where Peter has most spectacularly failed to live up to the name Rock. He didn't stand firm. He crumbled 3 times at the sound of a servant girl's question. And it's exactly here, in the wreckage of that failure, that Jesus reaches back and uses the old name. Not a new rebuke name, not Simon, the denier, the original name, Simon, son of John, the same words spoken the day they met. Here's what that repetition is doing, and it's easy to miss because it sounds like a small stylistic choice. John isn't simply reminding readers who Peter used to be. He's showing that Jesus is going back to the beginning, to before the name Peter was given at all, to rebuild the relationship from the same starting point it started from the first time. The name Simon isn't a demotion. It's a return to the foundation, so the name Peter can be laid on top of it again, deliberately, one more time, which is exactly what happens moments later when Jesus commissions him 3 times over, feed my sheep. Now put the scenes side by side, because this is where the pattern becomes unmistakable. Jacob, renamed at a river, in the dark, wounded, and the text keeps calling him by his old name the whole rest of the way home. Abraham, renamed inside a covenant ceremony, the new name carrying the promise itself. Peter, renamed at a lake, in the light. And Jesus himself reaches for the old name at the exact moment of his lowest failure, right before commissioning him forward. Different rivers, different centuries, the same quiet habit. The old name doesn't vanish. It gets used precisely when the person needs to be met honestly, not performatively. This is the connection worth sitting with. Scripture doesn't use the old name because the renaming failed. It uses the old name because the old name is where the person actually is standing at that moment, wounded, weeping, limping, ashamed, and God keeps meeting people there by the name that tells the truth about where they are, before calling them forward by the name that tells the truth about where they're going. That's not 2 competing identities. That's one identity, told in 2 tenses, who you have been and who you are becoming, both true, both spoken, neither one erasing the other. It's worth widening the lens one more time here, because this pattern doesn't stay confined to individuals. It grows, over the span of the whole canon, into something bigger than any one person's story. Long before Peter ever stood on that shore, the prophet Isaiah spoke of Zion, the people of God collectively, receiving a new name from the mouth of the Lord. You shall be called by a new name, Isaiah 62:2 says, a name that will mark a restored relationship after judgment and exile. It's a promise made to a nation still living, at the time it was spoken, in the ruins of what that promise described. The name comes before the reality it names, the same way Abraham was called father of many nations while childless, the same way Jacob was called Israel while still limping, the same way Peter was called Rock while still capable of denial. In each case, the name is spoken over a present tense that doesn't yet match it, a pattern this whole video keeps circling back to, whether at a wrestling match, a covenant ceremony, an exile, or a charcoal fire. That thread runs all the way to the final book of the New Testament. Revelation 2:17 promises the one who overcomes a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it. after a whole biblical pattern of very public renamings, witnessed by brothers, by narrators, by entire communities gathered at a well in Bethlehem. Scripture's last word on the subject is a name known privately, disclosed to no one but the individual and God. It's a striking inversion and worth naming as exactly what it is, not a settled doctrine to build confidently on, but a fitting final image for a pattern that has, from the very first river crossing, always held two things together at once, what has been true and what is becoming true, without asking either one to disappear. A river in the dark, a lake at dawn, a covenant sealed in a body's own flesh, a nation still in exile, promised a name it hadn't yet grown into, names given before they were earned, again and again, across centuries and languages and empires. Jacob crosses the Jabbok limping, a new name pressed onto him before the wound has even closed. Abraham hears, "Father of many nations," while Sarah is still childless in the tent behind him. Simon stands on the shore with wet hands, hearing the name he started with, spoken back to him at the exact moment he has nothing left to offer but failure. Daniel carries a Babylonian name in the mouths of his captors and his own name, quietly, in the mouth of the one telling his story. Naomi calls herself bitter, and the women of Bethlehem keep calling her pleasant until the bitterness has somewhere to stand beside. A nameless daughter is called not pitied until she isn't. Different centuries, different empires, different languages, Hebrew wrestling in the hill country, Greek fishing nets on Galilee, exiles counting years in Babylon, same pattern, underneath it all, quietly repeating. None of them got to leave the old self behind. Jacob still limped, Abraham still waited, Peter still wept. Daniel still answered, in his own heart if nowhere else, to the name his mother gave him. The names did not erase the people, the names got laid over them. New promise, old wound, both true, both carried, all the way to the end of every one of these stories. That's what a name change from God has actually been doing this whole time. Not a deletion, not a clean rewrite, a layering. Who you were, still visible underneath. Who you're becoming, spoken over the top of it. Before you've earned it, before you've proven it, sometimes in the very same breath as your worst failure. Israel still called Jacob, Peter still called Simon. Daniel still called Daniel, even in Babylon. Zion promised a name it hadn't received yet. Every renaming in this story pointing toward the same quiet truth. God does not wait for you to become someone else before he starts calling you by who you're becoming. And he does not stop calling you by the name that remembers where you've been. Two names, one person, the whole time. There's a particular kind of tired that doesn't show up on the outside. Jacob had it, crossing that river, decades of grasping behind him, a brother he was terrified to face on the other side, and no idea whether the man he'd become could survive the reunion. Abraham had a version of it too, an old man carrying a promise that hadn't come true yet, watching years pass with nothing but the name to hold on to. Peter had it, standing on that shore, still smelling of smoke from the fire he'd warmed himself at, while denying he even knew the man now cooking his breakfast. Most people never wrestle an angel or hear a rooster crow at their own betrayal. Most people never wait decades for a promise spoken over them to catch up to their actual life. But almost everyone knows what it feels like to be two people at once. The person you were, the mistakes still fresh enough to flinch at, the reputation you can't quite outrun even in your own head, and the person you're supposedly becoming, the one other people have started to believe in, or the one you've quietly hoped you might still turn into, if you're honest. There's a particular loneliness in that gap, in being called one thing and feeling like the other, in wondering whether the new name, the fresh start, the clean slate, was ever meant to erase the limp, or whether you were supposed to have stopped limping by now and haven't. In wondering, some mornings, whether the promise over your life is even still true, given how little of it has actually shown up yet. What this pattern in Genesis, Daniel, Ruth, and John seems to be saying, carefully and without exaggeration, is that the limp was never disqualifying, and neither was the waiting. Jacob wasn't renamed after he stopped grasping. Abraham wasn't renamed after Isaac arrived. Peter wasn't renamed after he stopped failing. The new name arrived in the middle of the old story, not after it was cleaned up, and Scripture never asked any of them to pretend the old name had stopped being true. Maybe that's the quiet weight of it. Not that you have to become someone else, to be called something new. Just that you're allowed to still be limping, still be waiting, still be Simon by the fire, and be spoken to anyway, by the name that isn't finished with you yet. You don't have to stop being who you were to be called who you're becoming. Scripture never did. If this changed the way you'll read Jacob's river or Peter's shoreline, that's the kind of discovery this channel exists for. Subscribe to the Scripture Project if you want to keep uncovering what's been sitting quietly in the text the whole time. And if someone in your life needs to hear that their old name doesn't disqualify them from a new one, this might be worth sending their way.